In this course, you'll learn everything you need to get started with CSS. We'll start by installing and preparing all the necessary tools to write your first CSS code. Then you'll learn about the basics of CSS. You'll learn how the browser applies CSS code and how to style various parts of your website. Throughout this course, I'm going to share with you lots of tips and shortcuts from my years of experience. I'll teach you how to write code like a professional developer. So when you end up watching this course, you'll have a solid foundation in CSS and be ready to learn about advanced CSS features. I've designed this course for anyone who wants to learn CSS. If you are a beginner, don't worry. I'll make CSS super simple for you, and you'll write your first CSS code in minutes. My name is Dima, and I'm a software engineer with over a decade of experience. I have worked for many companies, and I've helped many developers to grow their skills. And I think this course is a great place to start. I hope you will stick around and learn this powerful and modern styling language. To follow along, make sure you know the basics of HTML. If you want, you can learn the basics of HTML in this course. Also, the link is in the description. So let's get started. You'll need two main tools, a web browser and a code editor. The browser displays your web pages, and the code editor is where you'll write your CSS code. Any modern browser will do, but I recommend Google Chrome. For the code editor, Visual Studio Code or VS Code is a great option. It makes coding so much easier. Both Chrome and VS Code are free. I'll provide links in the description. If you want, you can choose other browsers or code editors. The key is to have a setup that lets you write code and see your work in action. With our tools ready, it's time to create our first CSS project. On your computer, create a new folder wherever it's convenient for you. I will create mine on the desktop. This folder will hold all the files for our website. Name it something you'll remember, like my website. Now, open VS Code or any other code editor of your choice and open your newly created folder. It's File, Open Folder. Then, create a new file and name it index.html. Now you learn how to change the color and size of your text with CSS. To achieve that, you learn how to add CSS to your web page, what a CSS rule, selector, and declaration block are, how to set properties and 2 properties to change text, and also 5 different types of selectors. So let's get started. We've got this simple HTML page. Let's use CSS to change our paragraph's text color to green. I like the practical approach, so I'm going to write the code first, make it work, and then I'll explain it. First, I'm going to add the style HTML element. Inside, I'll write p space, curly braces, color, green. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. Now our paragraphs are green. Congratulations, this is your first CSS code. Now let me explain it. We write CSS code inside the style HTML element. It's one of the 3 main ways to add CSS to your web page. This is a CSS rule. It says, find all the paragraphs on the page and make their text color green. A CSS rule has 2 parts. The first one is what elements we want to change, and the second one is what we want to change in those elements. The part where we say what elements to change is called a CSS selector. The part where we write the list of things we want to change is called a declaration block. Notice that I have all this formatting here. This space, this new line and spaces, this new line, this space too, they all are not required. But this is a good practice to have them like this to make our code more readable. But it's important that we put the selector first and then write all the properties we want to change in between the curly braces. A declaration block and a CSS selector together are a CSS rule. We can have as many CSS rules as we want. Let's add another one to make our headers text color blue. For that, I'm going to add a couple of new lines and write H2 to select all the header H2 elements. Space, curly braces, color, colon, royal blue, semicolon. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. They are royal blue. Great. Inside a declaration block, we can set as many properties as we want. To set a property, we write its name first, then colon, and then we put the value of that property and a semicolon. A semicolon says we're done configuring this property. Now it's possible to add another one. Let's do that and increase the text size of our headers. For that, I'm going to start from the new line and write font size, colon. What about 30 pixels, semicolon. This sets the height of our text in pixels. Refresh the page. There you go. Our headers now are bigger. Here, I tell the browser to find all the H2 elements on the page and make their text color royal blue and font size 30 pixels. If I made a mistake in a CSS rule and skip a required part, for example, if I remove this semicolon, then the browser will ignore this particular rule with this mistake altogether, but it will apply all the other CSS rules, and it won't apply this specific rule that contains a mistake. Let me show you that. Save the file, refresh the page, and now our headers are back to their default styles. I'm going to return back the correct CSS code. There you go. This part of the CSS rule is called a selector. Modern CSS has more than 50 different types of selectors. This is a tag selector. To use it, we write an HTML tag name without angle brackets, and the browser finds on our page all the elements of that specific tag. So these two selectors, they are tag selectors. There is also the ID selector. So you probably know that we can have the ID attribute in any HTML element. Let me add ID company to this first header element. Remember, the most important feature of the ID attribute, it must be unique on a page. We can't have two elements with the ID company on the same page. We can set any value here as long as it's unique on that page and no other element has that ID. So let's add another CSS rule that makes this header with the company ID green too. To use the ID selector, we write hash and then the actual ID value. In our case, it's company. It's important that there are no spaces or other symbols between the hash and the actual ID value. Next goes a regular declaration block. So curly braces, color, colon, green, semicolon. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. Now this header is green. So with this selector, we tell the browser to find the element on the page that has the company ID value, and then change its color to green. Notice that we have two CSS rules that both are trying to set the text color of this header element. The first CSS rule is trying to set it to royal blue, and the second one is trying to set it to green. So now we have a conflict here. CSS has several approaches to resolve that conflict and determine what rule wins. Here wins the ID selector rule. Because the ID selector have more weight, they are more specific than tag selectors, and tag selectors are more generic, so they have less weight. So ID selectors always win over tag selectors when there is such a conflict. This is a good thing to remember because you'll have conflicting CSS rules quite often. Notice that these two CSS rules, they do the same thing. They change the text color to green, but to different HTML elements. So I'm going to copy this ID selector and add here a comma, paste the ID selector, and remove this CSS rule altogether. Save the file, refresh the page, nothing has changed. This means it works. This is called a selector list. It tells the browser to find all the paragraph elements and the element that has the company ID. And then the browser changes the text color to green for all those elements. We can add as many selectors to this list as we want. Just separate each selector with a comma. Great. The next useful selector is the class selector. It's arguably the most widely used CSS selector because it's convenient and flexible. So you probably know we can assign one or multiple classes to HTML elements. I'll add class royal blue to this paragraph and this paragraph. Now let's use CSS to change the text color to royal blue only for these two paragraphs. So I'm going to write period, royal blue, space, curly braces, color, royal blue. A class selector starts with a period, then goes the name of the class. It's royal blue in our case. It's important that there are no spaces or other symbols between the period and the actual class name. This class selector tells the browser to find all the elements with the royal blue class attribute and set their text color to royal blue. Let's see whether it works. Great, now their text is actually royal blue. Notice that now these two CSS rules set the text color to royal blue. Let's improve our CSS code and use the selector list. So, comma, h2, and I'm going to remove this declaration. Save the file, refresh the page, nothing has changed. This means it works. Remember about conflicts between rules in CSS. If I add this class to this header element and save the file, refresh the page, the text is still green because an ID selector is the strongest or the most specific. So it wins over the class selector too. So that is somewhat close to the rock, paper, scissors game. The tag selector is the weakest and always loses to the class selector. The class selector always wins over the tag selector, but always loses to the ID selector. And the ID selector is the strongest. Even a million tag selectors cannot defeat a single class selector. And even a million class selectors cannot beat a single ID selector. We can combine different types of selectors. At this moment, this header has the class royal blue, and so do these two paragraphs have the class royal blue. But let's say I want to increase the font size only for these two paragraphs that have the royal blue class, and do not change anything about this header. So for that, I can write a CSS selector that targets only the paragraph elements that have the class royal blue. Space, curly braces, and let's set their font size to 25 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. Now they are bigger. Notice that the font size of the tech company hasn't changed. This is because this selector tells the browser to find only the paragraphs that have royal blue class and set their font size to 25 pixels. So this header element, it has the class royal blue, but it's not a paragraph. So we write CSS inside the style tag. CSS code consists of one or more CSS rules. A single CSS rule has a selector and a declaration block. A CSS selector is where we tell the browser what elements we want to change. To use the tag selector, we write a tag name without angle brackets. ID selectors start with hash and are used to find a single element on the page with that ID. Class selectors start with a period and are used to find all the element of that class on the page. We can combine many selectors in a list with a comma. We can combine a tag selector with a class selector, and it's going to be a compound selector. A declaration block is a list of declarations. A single declaration is a property name, colon, and a value we want to change, and every declaration with a semicolon. And these were the very basics of CSS. Let's discuss how to write comments in CSS. It's actually quite easy to do. In CSS, we start a comment with a slash and an asterisk, with no spaces or other symbols in between. Then, we can write any text we want, like green text, for example. The browser will ignore it anyway, because comments are for us, humans. We end our comment with an asterisk and a slash, again with no spaces or other symbols in between. Now, if I save the file and run the script, nothing has changed. That's because when the browser renders our web page, it ignores comments completely. But if we view the source code of this page, and for that I'm going to click the right mouse button in any free area of this web page and select View Page Source. This is the HTML source code the browser uses to render the page, and there is our comment. And because comments do not affect how our page looks or works, we can also use comments to disable our code temporarily. It's great for quickly testing different CSS code without deleting it. I'm going to close the source code. Now let me show you how to use CSS comments to disable this declaration that turns paragraphs and company text color green. For that, I'm gonna add /* to start a comment at the beginning of the declaration that I want to turn off, and I'm gonna add * to end this comment. Notice that VS Code changed the color of this code into gray. This means that it's now a CSS comment, and this part of the code is turned off. In programming, it's called to comment out this code. And if I save the file and refresh the page, now the paragraphs are black, so default color, and the header is blue. Let me uncomment this declaration. There you go. You can also comment out just a part of a line like this. And instead of green, I'm going to write red. Save the file, refresh the page. Now the text is red and the green value is completely ignored by the browser. You can also comment out multiple lines. Let's disable all these CSS rules. For that, I'm going to start our comment here and I'm going to put the ending comment mark here. Save the file, refresh the page. Now those CSS rules aren't applied. If you are using a code editor like VS Code, there is a shortcut to toggle your comments. Let me show you. I'm going to select our comment and go to the Edit menu and select the Toggle Line Comment option. There you go, VS Code uncommented this code. And if I want to comment out this code, I can go to the Edit menu and use the Toggle Line Comment option again. There you go. Now VS Code commented out this code. You're gonna comment out and uncomment your code quite frequently, so I recommend you to learn the keyboard shortcut for this action. For that, go to the Edit menu again, and to the right of this option, you can see the shortcut. For Mac, the shortcut is Command/. So if I hit Command/, now VS Code has uncommented this portion of the code. I can also put the cursor on any line and use the Command/ shortcut again. VS Code has commented this specific line where the cursor is. And if I use the shortcut again, VS Code has uncommented this line. You can also comment out a portion of your code. For that, select the code you want to comment out, go to the Edit menu, and use the Toggle Block Comment option. There you go. Now VS Code commented out only the selected portion of the code. And if I use that option again, the VS Code has uncommented this code. We can use those options to toggle comments in HTML too. So if I place the cursor somewhere on this line and hit Command/, now VS Code has turned this HTML into a comment. And if I hit Command/ again, the comment is gone. If you're using a different code editor like Sublime Text, just Google what shortcut to use in your editor to toggle comments. It's a real time saver. So to add comments in CSS, use /* to start a comment and */ to end that comment. Use comments in CSS to explain your code where needed or turn off parts of your CSS code. Comments might not look very useful, but you'll use them a lot during development to temporarily turn off and on bits of your code. And this is how you add comments in CSS. Now you learn the essentials of working with text in CSS. We'll discuss how to align your text to the left, right, or center with the text align property, how to make your text slanted or italic with the font style property, how to use different fonts with font family, how to make text thin or thick with the font weight property, and how to configure the amount of space between lines of text with line height. So let's get started. Let's discuss how to change the alignment of your text with the text align property. We can align our text to the left, center, or to the right, and our browser aligns most of the text to the left by default. Let's create that in code. For that, I'm going to close this tab and we will start from the blank page. First, let's add some HTML content for us to style. I'll add a div element and it's going to have the CSS is great text. If you don't know, the div element is a block level element. It takes up all the width available, and divs don't have any extra styles, so they are perfect as container elements. Let's also add the class attribute, and it's going to be 1. And now we'll need 2 more divs. They will have the same text, but I'm going to change the classes to 2 and 3. I'll also add the HR elements in between divs to separate them visually. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. 3 perfectly identical divs for us to style. Notice that in all these divs, the text is aligned to the left by default. Now let's align this text to the center and this text to the right. Let's start with this div. So I'm going to add a CSS rule. We'll use a class selector, so period 2. Then inside the declaration block, I'm gonna use the text align property and the value will be center, semicolon. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. The text is in the center now. To align this div's text to the right, I'll add another CSS rule and it's going to use class selector 3. Inside the declaration block, it's going to be text align right. Save the file, refresh the page. Great, it's aligned to the right. So the browser aligns text and inline elements inside the element you've applied the text align property to. Now let me show you how it's going to look like with longer text. For that, let's open the page on CSS on Wikipedia, and I will copy the first paragraph from this page. And then I will paste that first paragraph inside each div. Now, because this text is quite long, we cannot see our HTML code, and we need to use the scroll bar to scroll to the left until we see it. VS Code has a great feature to fix that. To enable it, go to the settings and search for the wrap keyword. We are interested in this word wrap setting. At this moment, it's turned off, but let's turn it on and see what happens. Close the settings. Now there is no horizontal scroll bar and all the text is visible. I recommend to keep the word wrap setting always turned on because it makes working with the long lines much easier. For example, if I want to remove a portion of this text, it's much easier to do with the word wrap enabled. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. As you can see with the left alignment, the browser keeps all the lines of text aligned to the left. With the center alignment, it keeps all them centered. And with the right alignment, it keeps them all aligned to the right. Great! The text align property is easy to use and often used for text formatting and to center menu items. Now, let me show you how to make your text italic or slanted to the right with the font style property. For that, I'm going to first revert our text back to the CSS is great. We don't need the third div, so I'm going to comment it out with the HR element. For that, I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut Command/, and then let's remove the text align properties so that we start from the blank slate. Back to the browser, close this tab, refresh the page, all normal text. Now let's make the second div's text italic. For that, I'm going to add the font style property and it'll be italic. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. Now the second div's text is italic. Usually, web developers use the italic font style for quotes, technical terms, references, annotations, and titles. Font style is simple, effective, and easy to use. The next property, font family, is so powerful because it allows you to change the font of your text. This is the same text, but different fonts are applied from 5 main font groups or generic font families: serif, sans serif, monospace, cursive, and fantasy. We'll discuss what a generic font family is in a minute. Now let me show you how to use the font family property. For that, I'm going to remove the font style property because we don't need it for now. And I'll write font family, and we'll use the Tahoma font here. So when I refresh the page, the second div's text should use the Tahoma font, and we should be able to tell the difference between how the first and the second div's text look. So save the file, back to the browser, refresh the page. There you go. These two divs are using different fonts. If you run this code and the text didn't change, this means that the Tahoma font is not available in your browser. In this case, your browser uses the default font and the text in both divs should look the same. I'm going to replicate that and change the Tahoma name to something that 100% doesn't exist on my computer. So QWERTY and random. Save the file, back to the browser, refresh the page. Now they look the same. So when you specify the font that doesn't exist on user's computer, the browser will just use the default font available. When you want to use a font that contains spaces or special characters, you need to wrap that font name in quotes. As an example, I'm going to use the Courier space new font. Save the file, back to the browser, refresh the page. this text now looks very different. We can also have a list of fonts as a value for the font family. For that, we just need to separate them with comma. So I'm going to write Tahoma, comma, space. In this case, the browser will try to apply the first font from the left, and if it's not available, then it will use the second font from the list. If the second font is not available, it will try to use the third font, or if there are no fonts in this list, the browser will just use the default font. Save the file, refresh the page, there you go. Now the font is Tahoma. But if I change Tahoma's name to some gibberish, like this, save the file, refresh the page. Now the font is Courier New. So the browser tried to apply the first font from this list. It wasn't available, and then the browser used the Courier New font. Let me change it back to Tahoma. If you want to make sure that the font you're using is most likely available in the user's web browser, you can use a what's called web safe font. To know what fonts are web safe, just Google web safe fonts and open this first link from the V3 schools. And here's the list of the best web safe fonts for HTML and CSS. These fonts are considered web safe because they are available on most computers and devices. And we've already used the Tahoma and Courier New fonts from this list. Notice that there is additional text in parentheses. This is called a generic font family. A generic font family is a group of fonts that have common features. There are 5 most widely used generic font families on the web, and they are serif, sans serif, monospace, cursive, and fantasy. Serif fonts have small lines at the end of strokes. They are traditional and considered formal or classic. Sans serif fonts lack small lines at the end of strokes. They are modern, clean, and used for readability. Monospace fonts have equal spacing between each character. They are great for code because letters align. Cursive fonts mimic handwriting, and fantasy fonts are decorative and often used for impact. We can use a generic font family instead of a specific font name. Let's do that for all 5 font families. For that, I'm going to need to uncomment this bit of HTML, and let's have 2 more. I'm going to change this class to 4 and this class to 5. Next, I'll add a CSS rule that sets font family to serif for the first div. Then we'll change the font family of the second div to sans serif. Then we'll set the font family of the third div to monospace. Then we'll add another CSS rule for the div number 4, and its font family is going to be cursive. And another CSS rule for the div number 5, and its font family is going to be fantasy. Save the file, back to the browser, and refresh the page. There you go. Now all 5 divs are using fonts from different font families. When we specify a generic font family, like serif for example, the browser uses any font from this font family that is available in your website visitor's web browser. It's very safe to set a generic font family because the likelihood you have a font from this family is the highest. This is why if you want to set a font for your text, let's say for example, I want to set the Poetsen 1 font for the text of the second column, a good practice would be to specify this font first, then to add a web-safe font, for example, Tahoma, to the list as a fallback in case the Poetsen 1 is missing in the user's web browser, and then, add a generic font family like sans serif, for example, as a fallback in case the Tahoma is missing. In this case, the browser will try to use the Poetsen 1 font first. If it's unavailable, it will try to apply the web-safe font, and for the tiny group of users that don't even have the Tahoma font, the browser will use any sans serif font available. Let me show you now how big tech companies configure fonts for their websites. Apple, for example, for the text on their website, sets 3 custom fonts first, then 2 web-safe fonts, and then a generic font family as a fallback. Amazon uses a custom font first, then a web-safe font, and then the sans serif generic font family. YouTube uses a custom font first, then a web-safe font, and then again the sans serif generic font family. Also notice that they all are using the sans serif generic font family as a fallback. That's because sans serif fonts are clean, modern, and have a good readability. So I would recommend using the approach Amazon and YouTube apply. 1 custom font first, then a web-safe font, and then the sans serif font family. It's simple but safe, powerful, and flexible. Most of the time, you can even skip the custom font and start with a web-safe font. And this is how you set a font of your text. Use the font family property. Specify 1 or more fonts and separate them with comma. Wrap the font name in quotes if it contains spaces or special characters. The next property that you'll use a lot is font weight. We use it to configure how thick or thin the text appears. Let's create that in code. First, I'm gonna close these 3 tabs and then go over to VS Code. For the font weight, we'll need 3 divs. So I'm gonna remove these 2. And also I'll remove these 2 CSS rules and remove these font family properties to start from the blank slate. Now let's set the font weight for the first div. We use here unitless values, where the smallest value for the thinnest text is 100 and the biggest value for the thickest text is 900. I'm gonna set 300 here and semicolon. For the second div, let's use font weight 400. And for the third div, let's use font weight 600 to make it thick. Save the file and go to our web page, refresh the page. This one is quite thick, but these 2 have the same thickness. How is that? That's because the current font doesn't support font weight values lower than 400. And so even if we set font weight to 300 here, the browser uses the nearest available font weight, which is 400. And even if I set font weight to 100 for the first div and to 900 for the third div, save the file, refresh the page, nothing changes here. So again, that happens because my current font supports only 2 font weights, normal 400 and bold 600. When we set the font weight values for the first and the third divs that are not supported by the current font, the browser uses the closest available supported font weight. So for us to make this text of the first div thinner, we need to use a different font. Let's do that. I'm gonna add another CSS rule. This time it'll use the div tag selector, and inside the declaration block, I'm gonna ask the browser to use any font from the sans serif generic font family. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. The font is different now, and so do the thickness level. Notice that now the first div's text is thinner than the second div text, but still it's thinner, but not as thin as I would expect for the font weight of 100. That's because the current font supports the lowest font weight value of 300. And this text doesn't look like its font weight is 900, so I would guess that it's still 600. If we want to make our text even thicker or thinner than these values, we need to use a different font that supports 100 and 900 or the other font weight values that we would like our text to have. And this is how you use the font weight property to change how thin or thick your text is. Use values in the range from 100 to 900 in increments of 100. And also make sure that your font supports the font weight you want to set. Let me quickly show you how the text with the font weight of 100 and 900 might look like. For that, I'm going to open a font that supports those values in Google Fonts. Let me increase the font size. So this is how thin the text with the font weight 100 is. And this is how thick the font with the font weight 900 is. Now, let's discuss how to change the line height of your text. We can make our text to become less dense vertically or more dense. The line height property sets the height of each line of text. This is crucial for readability. Let's create that in code. I'll close this tab and I will copy this text from Wikipedia about CSS. Now, to test this property, we'll need only one div. So I'm going to remove these two and I will leave only one CSS rule here. And also I will remove the font weight property. Now I'll paste the text from Wikipedia here and we're ready to change the line height. So it's line height. A good practice is to use a unitless value for the line height. I'm gonna put 1 here. This number is a multiplier. The browser uses the font size of this element and multiplies by this number to calculate the line height. This is flexible and convenient. In our case, the line height of this text is gonna be 1 multiplied by its font size. So it's going to be equal to its font size. Save the file and switch the tab, refresh the page. Now this text is quite dense vertically. If I change, for example, the line height to 2, save the file, refresh the page, now the line height is noticeably bigger. And if I set it to 3, save the file, refresh the page, now the line height of this text is 3 times of its font size. A good practice for text readability is to set the line height value somewhere between 1.5 and 2, where the sweet spot is 1.6. Save the file, refresh the page. This is much better. And this is how you set the line height of your text. And these were the essentials of working with text in CSS. To align your text, use the text align property. You can align to the left, center, or right. To make your text slanted to the right or italic, use the font style property. To change the font of your text, use the font family property. The best practice is to specify your custom font first, then at least one web-safe font, and then a generic font family as a fallback. To configure how thick or thin your text is, use the font weight property and values from 100 to 900. Now you learn how to transform and decorate text with CSS. Let's start with how to transform your text to become all uppercase, all lowercase, or capitalized. We'll start with a blank page, and this is how our initial HTML looks like. First, we need to create 3 div elements. Each will have the text CSS is great, and I'm going to use the class attribute. For the first div, the value is going to be 1. For the second div, it's going to be 2. And for the third div, it's going to be 3. Now I'm going to go to the browser, refresh the page. We have the text to transform. Let me zoom in to make the text bigger. Now let's use CSS to transform the text of this first div to be all uppercase. In VS Code, in the style element, I'm going to add a CSS rule. To point to the first div, I'll use a class selector, and inside the declaration block, I'm going to add text transform, and the value is going to be uppercase. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. The text is all uppercase. Now let's transform the second div. I'll add another CSS rule. This time the class will be 2, and the text transform value is going to be lowercase. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go, all lowercase. And now let's capitalize the text of the third div. In VS Code, I'm going to add the third CSS rule, period 3, and text transform is going to be capitalize. Save the file, refresh the page. Now every first letter in this div is uppercase. The only exception is abbreviations. Usually, people use the text transform property to style navigation menus, headings, buttons, and form labels. Now let's decorate our text. In VS Code, I'm going to remove all the text transform properties to focus only on decoration. And for the first div, let's add text decoration line, underline. All the links have that decoration by default. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. Now it's underlined. We can also make the decoration line to be line through. There you go. And also overline. And now the decoration line is above the text. It's also possible to use multiple values separated by a space here. Let me add line through and underline. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. Usually, this combined decoration happens in visual text editors. The next property we can configure for our text decoration is their color. To do that, I'm going to write text decoration color, and I'll use gold. Because who doesn't like gold? Save the file, refresh the page. Ooh, this is colorful. If we have multiple decoration lines for our text, the text decoration color property affects all of them. Having 3 lines simultaneously is a little bit too much, so I'm going to leave only the underline decoration. Save the file, refresh the page. This is better. We can also change the style of our decorations with the text decoration style property. By default, it's solid, which is just a straight continuous line. We've got more interesting styles available. Double. This is how it looks like, 2 straight lines. Then dotted. There you go. We also have dashed. Good. And the last one is wavy. Oh, this doesn't look good. This wavy decoration is broken for some reason in zoomed in pages. I'm going to reset it back to normal size and zoom with OS tools. There you go. Now the wavy decoration looks good. I'm going to make the line dotted again and refresh and zoom in our text more. The last property we can configure is the thickness of the decoration line. We do this with the text decoration thickness property. Just for the sake of fun, let's use bigger numbers. How about 15 pixels? Save the file, refresh the page. Ooh, the dots are quite big. And now they are overlapping with the text of the second div. That's because text decoration doesn't affect elements layout, height, or width. To fix this, we can increase the line height of our first div so that every line of text requires more space. So I'll add line height and set something around 5. So the line height of our first div is now 5 times the text's font size. Save the file, refresh the page. That's better. Now this text allocates enough space so that the decoration doesn't overlap the second div. But usually we want smaller thickness values, something like 3 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. This is better. When you want to set several text decoration properties at once, as we do here, there is a more concise way to do so. We can use what's called a shorthand property to set all these values or only a few. Let's rewrite this code to use the shorthand property. I'm going to add a couple of new lines. This will make it easier for us to compare both approaches. Now I'll write text decoration. And then as a value, we can set all these properties or only a few and separate their values with a space. The first value must be from text decoration line. So I'll use underline space. Next goes color, so gold. Then we must put the text decoration style, so dotted. And the last one is thickness, 3 pixels. Notice that this shorthand property uses way less space and is much more readable than when we set all these properties individually. And you can also set here 1 value or 2 values or 3 values. Just make sure that the order is correct. So most of the time, I would recommend using the shorthand property instead of individual properties. Individual properties are useful when you want to change decoration parts of the same element in different CSS rules. Now to check that this shorthand property works, let me comment out our individual properties, save the file, refresh the page, nothing has changed. This means it works. So to decorate your text, use whenever you can this shorthand text decoration property, or if you need, use individual decoration properties, which are text decoration line, color, style, and text decoration thickness. Now you know how to transform and decorate text with CSS. Now you learn how to customize links with CSS. Then how to create this using what you've learned. Let's discuss how to style links. This part I like the most because we'll start writing interactive styles. First, we'll need some links. I'm gonna quickly add like 4 links and wrap them in paragraphs to place each link on a new line and have extra vertical space for decoration. And an H3 header, say web tech. Save the file, refresh the page. Now we have some links to style. Notice that the browser adds default styles to all links. They all have text decoration underline. Unvisited links are blue by default. And if I click the link, it becomes red for the time my mouse button is down. If I release the mouse button, the browser opens Wikipedia page about HTTP protocol. Let's return to our page and refresh it. This link is now purple because we visited that page, and visited links are purple by default. Let's now customize all these default styles with CSS. Let's change the color of all unvisited links to green. For that, I'm gonna add a CSS rule. We'll need a tag selector, so A to refer to all the links on our page. And to narrow it down to only unvisited links, I'll use a new type of selector called pseudoclass and write :link. This tells the browser to find all the links that haven't been opened yet. That is, the links that I haven't clicked yet. Pseudoclass selectors let you refer to certain states of your elements, like unvisited links or when you hover over a link. We want to make unvisited links green, so I'll write color green. Save the file, refresh the page. Good, unvisited links are green. Now let's make all the visited links a slightly different shade of green. For that, I'll add another CSS rule. The selector will be A:visited to change only visited links, and the color will be dark olive green. Save the file, refresh the page. Now this visited link has a slightly different shade of green. I'd like to make a decoration line appear above the link when we hover over it. We'll need another CSS rule. This time we want to change the hover state of our links. For that, we use the hover pseudoclass. And you already know what I'm gonna write next. It's gonna be text decoration over line. Save the file, refresh the page. Now, when I hover over a link, the line goes above. And when I move the cursor away, the line goes back to its original position. That's because we ask the browser to apply text decoration over line when the cursor is over the link. Now, let's make our links bolder and brighter when we click on them. I'll need another CSS rule. It's going to be A:active to configure the active state of our links. The properties we want to change in this active state are font weight 600 for bold and color yellow-green. The browser sets these properties only in case when we click a link. Save the file, refresh the page. Now let me try to click on the link to check that. There you go, bold and brighter. Often you want your visited and unvisited links to look the same. For that, we could set the color to green here too, but it would make our CSS code more fragile and harder to maintain. Because in that case, if we wanted to change our links color, we need to remember to update both these rules for unvisited links and for visited links. A better way would be to combine them in a list like this with the help of list selector. And I'm going to remove this remainder of CSS rule. This selector list tells the browser to find all the unvisited links and all the visited links, and then change their text color to green. To check that, I'm gonna save the file, refresh the page. There you go. Now they all are green, and our CSS code is more efficient and robust. We can also use pseudo classes with other HTML elements, not only with links. Let's say we want this header to become bigger when we hover over it. I'd like to use the ID selector to refer to this header, so I'm gonna add the ID first. It's gonna be tech header. Next, I'll add another CSS rule. I'll start with hash to select an element by its ID, then tech header, and then I'll write the hover pseudo class to apply this rule only on hover. We're not limited to use pseudo classes only with tag selectors. We can use pseudo classes with other types of selectors too, like with ID selectors. When we hover over the header, I want to change its font size to 1.6 em. Em is another unit of measure. Em is relative to the font size of the element. So 1.6 em means that the final font size for this header on hover will be its original font size multiplied by 1.6. So em units work in a similar way as unitless values for the line height property you've seen in the text essentials video previously in this course. The em name is not an abbreviation. CSS developers took this name from printing and typography. Save the file, refresh the page. Great, now the header becomes bigger when I hover over it. Also notice when I hover over the header, the cursor changes to a different symbol. But what if we want the cursor to remain the same when I hover over this header? We can configure this with the cursor property. For the cursor to stay the same on hover, I'll use the default value. Save the file, refresh the page. Now the cursor stays the same. The list of all possible values for the cursor property is huge. I'm gonna put the link to this MDN page in the description. Go there, try different values, have fun, and don't be afraid to experiment and write some CSS code yourself. You will learn CSS much faster this way. Okay, now let's make the huge dots header on hover that I showed you in the intro. It's actually quite easy to do. For that, I'm gonna add the text decoration property. Its value is gonna be underline, overline, dotted. The color will be gold, and the line thickness will be 20 pixels. Next, I'll add the text transform property, and it's gonna be uppercase. The font style property will be italic. If you're not familiar with these properties, watch the previous videos in this course on text. I'm gonna add links to those videos in the description. Now I'll save the file, refresh the page, and when I hover over the link, boom, we have this crazy decoration and header styles. Most of the time, you don't want such styles to appear on real websites. But I found this helpful when I was learning CSS to try to set huge, bizarre values and have fun with CSS, even break things on purpose. This helped me to learn CSS much faster and better. So I encourage you to experiment with tiny, normal, and huge values for all the CSS properties that you're learning. This way, you'll learn the boundaries of what's possible for these properties, and also you'll have more fun during the process. Okay, so to style your links, use the link pseudo class for unvisited links, the visited pseudo class for visited links, the hover pseudo class to style your links and other HTML elements when somebody hovers over them, and the active pseudo class to apply your styles to the clicked links. Now you learn how to add solid and image backgrounds to your HTML elements. Then how to control your image background with 3 different properties. And you learn 2 most practical and widely used formats for colors in web, RGB and hex. So let's get started. First, I'm going to add a simple div element with the content backgrounds in CSS. We'll add a background to this div in a couple of seconds. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go, just a plain content. Now to add a background to this div, I'm gonna create a CSS rule where I'll use a tag selector. Inside the declaration block, I'll write background color. How about light sky blue? Save the file, refresh the page. Now this div has a nice blue background. The browser renders the background inside the content area of an element. And because div is a block level element, its content takes up all the width available. Let's increase the font size of the text inside this div with the font size property to a huge value, something like 250 pixels, so that the content area of this div would take more space. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. Notice that the background area has increased with the content. Now in CSS, there are many ways to set the color we want. We've used keywords so far. They are easy to remember and work with for us humans. I'll show you 2 more popular ways among web developers to set the color. For that, we'll need a tool called Color Picker. Many programs have a color picker. We'll use the one from Google. So let's open a new tab and Google Color Picker. And there you go, a color picker. Here we can select any color we want and use its values in different color formats. We are interested in the hex and RGB formats here. They are most widely used and practical. RGB is for red, green, and blue. In RGB we have 3 numbers. Each sets the amount of red, green, and blue for our color. Now the hex format is short for hexadecimal, which is just a different way of representing numbers in math and programming. A color in the hex color format starts with a hash symbol, and then it's actually again the amount of red, green, and blue, just in the hexadecimal number format. In practice, you don't need to change these values manually. Just select the color you want in a color picker and copy its hex or RGB value. So to use this, let's select the color we like. What about a different shade of blue? Then I'll copy this hex value and I'm going to remove this keyword and paste the hex value I just copied. It's important to copy the value with the hash symbol and have the hash symbol at the beginning. Otherwise, it won't work. Save the file, back to our page, refresh it. There you go. Now our background color is a different shade of blue. Now let me show you how to use RGB colors. I'm going to pick a different color, something closer to orange. Now I'm going to follow the same path and copy everything under the RGB section. Then I'm going to go to VS Code and paste the values, save the file, back to our page, refresh it, and the background disappears completely. Now, when that happens, it means most likely that we put an invalid color value, and the browser uses a default color for the background, which is transparent. To fix that, we need to add RGB and parentheses to our color value. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. Now it works. Okay, now the question is, why do we need to use these cryptic values at all? Because it seems that keywords like gold or blue are more friendly and easier to remember and use. Now, one of the reasons is that when we use keywords like gold or red to set our colors, we're limited to somewhere nearly 150 different color values. But when we use the RGB or hex formats to set our colors, we have more fine-grained control over the colors. And we have nearly 16 million different colors and shades available for us to use. So you can use RGB and hex values in any place where a color value is expected. For example, to set text color. So select the color format based on your needs. Now let me show you how to add a background image for an element with CSS. A background image in CSS is simply an image that appears behind the content of an HTML element. It's like the wallpaper on your desktop or the background on your phone's home screen. To set a background image, we use the CSS property called background image. Then, as a value, we use the URL function to set where our image is located. Here, we can put a link with a full path to an image available on the internet. I'll paste this URL. You can use it too if you want. Or, if you have an image in your website's folder, you can just use its name here instead, like this. But I'll stick to the URL. And I'm gonna end this declaration with a semicolon. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. Now our div has a background image. Look how the browser repeats this image. By default, background images repeat both vertically and horizontally to fill the entire area of the element. We can change that with the background repeat property. Let's set it to no repeat. Now our image should be used only once. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. The image is rendered only once, but the rest of the background is filled with this solid orange color. That's because we've set both the background color and background image. The background image covers the background color. So in the areas where there is no background image, we'll see this solid color. This means that we can use the background color as a fallback in case our image doesn't load. Let me put a random character into the image so that the URL points to a non-existing location. Save the file, refresh the page. Now the browser cannot load the image and fills all the background with this solid color. But let me put back the valid URL. We can configure our image to only repeat across the x-axis. For that, I'm going to change the value to repeat x. Save the file, refresh the page, something like this. And also, if we want, we can configure it to only repeat across the y-axis. For that, I'm going to change the x character to y. Save the file, refresh the page, there you go. And I'm going to set it to no repeat. Great. Now, if we want to change the position of our background image, we can use the background position property. Let's move it 200 pixels from the left and 50 pixels from the top. Save the file, refresh the page, there you go. Now the image is 200 pixels to the right and 50 pixels to the bottom. We can also change the size of our background image with the background size property. I'll set the width to 400 pixels and the height should change automatically in proportion. Save the file, refresh the page. Now the image is proportionally bigger. If we really want, we can set also the height as the second value. So something like 50 pixels. And we also need to have the space between the width and the height, otherwise it won't work. Save the file, refresh the page. Yeah, something like this. But I'm gonna remove the height value here. Save the file, refresh the page. Now it's better. So, to add a solid background to your HTML elements, use the background color property. Use either a keyword, a hex, or RGB value. To use an image as a background, use the background image property, and then the URL function. Inside this function, specify either a link or a local path to an image. Use the background repeat, position, and size properties to configure your background image. And this is how you add a background to your elements. Developer Tools is a lifesaver. It's a set of utilities that are built into most modern web browsers. They help us to get a lot of useful information about our web page and CSS and provide hundreds of amazing features. There are 3 ways to open developer tools. The first way is through menu. In Chrome, open the View menu, then Developer and Developer Tools. This way is useful to remember the keyboard shortcut to open developer tools. I highly recommend you memorize and use this shortcut because you'll use developer tools all the time. So for Mac, the shortcut is Option-Command-I. The last way to open developer tools is to click the right mouse button on any element on the page and then select the inspect option. It opens developer tools too. Most of the time, I prefer using the shortcut to open developer tools. Okay, so there is plenty you can do in developer tools. We can inspect the HTML and CSS of a page. Test how our web page works on different devices and screen sizes, check performance and accessibility, debug JavaScript, and so much more. When I started working as a web developer, there were no built-in developer tools in the browser, and life was like 100 times harder without these tools. So I'm glad that nowadays, when you're starting, you have all these amazing developer tools. At first, it might seem overwhelming. Don't worry, you'll learn all that gradually, and today we're interested in the Elements tab. This tab is divided into 2 main areas. The left one is to work with the HTML of our web page, and the right one is mostly for the CSS and JavaScript. Now let me turn off the mobile view. In the HTML area, we're interested in selecting an element. We can do this by using the HTML browser and just clicking on the element like this. The selected element becomes blue. This is convenient when you have a small web page like our little web page with less than 10 elements. But any modern website has hundreds or thousands of HTML elements. Here is, for example, how the HTML browser looks for Amazon. It's not practical to select an element manually here. So for that case, we've got another way to select an element on a web page, and it's by using this Element Inspector button. Click it to activate the Element Inspector, and then hover over and click on any element you want to select on the page. And now it becomes selected in the HTML browser. Okay, let's close Amazon and inspect the block element on our page. Notice that when I inspect an element, the second area updates. It provides plenty of information for us about the element and tools to change the inspected element. For example, we can look at its CSS styles, and here we can not only see the styles but modify them. For example, turn off and on properties, change values in place like this, and add more styles. This is a goldmine for learning and development. The changes you make here are available only for you. They are temporary and they will be gone when you leave or refresh the page. So if I refresh the page, this background should become green again. There you go. Okay, that was a quick introduction to developer tools. Okay, that's all great, but what about this blank space around our elements? Where does it come from? This blank space is margin. It's a part of the box model and one of the 4 parts that every HTML element has. So every HTML element has a box around it. That box is like an onion with 4 layers. The browser handles them differently for block and inline elements. So today you'll learn about the content, padding, border, and margin layers and their differences for the block and inline elements. It's absolutely important for you to understand the box model in CSS because you'll work with it in one way or another most of the time. It's a part of every element on your web page. For that, we'll use developer tools. So to study it, we are interested here in the Computed tab. In this area, the browser visualizes the box model of our element, and it's all 4 layers. Our div doesn't have any margin, border, or padding, so the values are blank. And this blue rectangle in the center is for the content area. The left value is width in pixels, and the right value is height in pixels. Notice when I hover over this blue rectangle that represents the div's content area, the browser simultaneously highlights the actual content area on the page. Okay, so the content is the first layer in the box model. It's where text and images appear. The div's content area is this text and this free space. Because div is a block element, so the browser stretches out its content area to take up all the width available. The link's content area is only as big as its text, because it's an inline element. For block elements, such as our div, we can set the width and height of the content area. For that, we use the properties with the same names. So, let's set the width of our div to 200 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page, there you go. Now it doesn't take up all the width and only is 200 pixels wide. Now, by default, the block element's content area is as high as the height of the content inside. So this div's content area is as high as this text. Let's change its height and set it to, say, 50 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. Now it takes up more vertical space. We can set the width and height for block elements, but we cannot set the width and height for inline elements. If we try to do so, the browser will just ignore those properties. Let me show you. I'm gonna copy those properties to our second CSS rule that affects all the links on our page. Save the file, refresh the page, and the link size hasn't changed at all. And the content box for our link still matches the actual text size, even though we have these numbers here that the browser just ignores. Okay, so adding the width and height properties for inline elements is just a waste of time. So I'm gonna remove them. Now the second layer in the box model is padding. Padding adds empty space around the content. We can configure it with the padding property. Let's add some padding to our div. It's gonna be padding, 10 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. Notice that padding shifted the div's content. And now if I inspect the div in Developer Tools, we have 10 pixels of padding on all sides. And when I hover over the padding, the browser highlights it for the element on the page. Okay, the padding property actually is a shorthand property. When we put a single value here, the browser sets this padding value to all the sides. But if we want, we can set the padding value for every side separately. Let's do that. First goes the top padding value. It's gonna be 10 pixels, so I'm gonna leave this value as it is. Space. Then we put the value for the right padding, 20 pixels. Then the bottom, 30 pixels. And the last one is for the left padding. It's 40 pixels. We need to separate each value with a space. Save the file, refresh the page, there you go. 10, 20, 30, and 40. So the order is always top, right, bottom, and left. You can memorize the order by imagining a clock. Start at the top, 12 o'clock, and move clockwise. So top, right, bottom, and left. Or you can use the treble mnemonic for top, right, bottom, and left. Make sure you remember this order. You'll use it often with padding and other properties too. I used different padding values here for us to easily distinguish the sides. Normally, you'd use symmetrical values here, like 10 pixels for the top and bottom, 20 pixels for the right and left. symmetrical padding values are used so frequently that the browser allows us to set only the top and right values like this. And then it's going to repeat them for the other sides. So if I set the padding value like this, the browser will use 10 pixels for the top padding and also for the bottom padding, and 20 pixels for the right and left padding. Save the file, refresh the page, there you go. 1010, 2020. Now let's look at the third layer of the box modal, which is the border. It surrounds the padding and content layers. Let's set the border for our div. So it's going to be border, colon, and first we specify how thick our border is. Let's make it 5 pixels. Then we can set the style. Most of the values here are the same as with the text decoration style property. I'll set solid to have a single line border. Then we can set the color. It's going to be royal blue. Save the file, refresh the page, there you go. Now we have a 5 pixel royal blue border around this div. The border property is a shorthand property that creates the border from all 4 sides. We can add the side name if we want the border only on one or several sides. Let's change it so our border is only on the top. I'll add dash and then goes the side name, so top. Save the file, refresh the page, royal blue border on the top. Let's add another one for the bottom. So I'm going to write border dash bottom colon 5 pixels solid royal blue. Save the file, refresh the page, there you go, top and bottom. Let's add another one for the left side. Save the file, refresh the page, great. And we can change it to the right for the right side. Refresh the page, there you go. The last layer for our box is the margin. Margin is the space outside the border of an element. Margins push other elements away from the box. Like paddings, margins don't have color. They are transparent. But unlike paddings, background doesn't extend to margins. You'll see that in a second. Now let's set a margin for our div. I'll write margin colon, and what about 15 pixels? Save the file, refresh the page. Now there is a 15 pixel margin that separates our div from the outside elements. In developer tools, it's this orange area. The margin property is a shorthand property too. When we have one value here, the browser will use it to set the top, right, bottom, and left margins. And just like with the padding property, we can separately configure every side here too. And the side order is the same: top, right, bottom, and left. So just like with padding, the values go clockwise, starting from the top. Okay, so 5 pixels for the top margin, 10 pixels for the right, 20 pixels for the bottom, and 40 pixels for the left. Save the file, refresh the page, there you go. 5, 10, 20, and 40. And like with padding, we can set 2 values here, and the browser will use them for the rest sides. Refresh the page, the browser used 5 pixels for the top and bottom sides, and 10 pixels for the right and left sides. If you want to set a margin only for one side, then CSS has a property for that. Say we want to set only the left margin to 30 pixels. I'll remove this, and then I'm going to write margin dash left and 30 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. Now there is only the left margin, which is 30 pixels. When we add padding, border, and margin to a block element like our div or a paragraph, the browser pushes all the elements outside the box. So if I add the margin bottom property and set it to say 10 pixels, save the file, refresh the page, the link is pushed 10 pixels down. And if I increase the border bottom for our div to say 15 pixels, save the file, refresh the page, the link is pushed down even further. Same with padding. Let me increase the padding top and bottom to 15 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page, the link is pushed down even further. Now it works this way with block elements. With inline elements, it's a different story. Now let me duplicate our link a couple of times to have a couple of inline elements right next to each other. And I'm gonna add the BR element here to move this link to the next line. Save the file, refresh the page, close developer tools. There you go. Now we have 3 inline elements here. Okay, so first let's add the top and bottom borders to all of our links. I'm just gonna copy these. Save the file, refresh the page. When I refreshed the page, the top and bottom borders appeared, but the browser didn't push away any elements. That's because for inline elements, the top and bottom borders, paddings, and margins are applied, but will not make other elements move away. But let's test them. So I'll add top and bottom paddings. So padding top, 5 pixels, and the same for the padding bottom. Save the file, refresh the page. Again, the box and background of our links have increased, but the browser didn't move away any elements. Only the borders were pushed away because they are parts of those links. Lastly, I'll add huge top and bottom margins to our links. So margin top, 100 pixels. And margin bottom is going to be 100 pixels too. Save the file, refresh the page, and again, nothing moved. The browser just ignored the top and bottom margins of our links because they are inline elements. So it's important for you to remember that for inline elements, the bottom and top paddings, borders, and margins are applied but will not cause other elements to move away. But with left and right paddings, borders, and margins, it's a different story. They will cause other elements to move away. To test that, let's add the same borders, but now for the left and right. Save the file, and when I refresh the page, look at what happens to the link. And refresh. The browser pushed the links farther away. Now let's add left and right paddings. So padding left, 5 pixels, and padding right, 5 pixels too. Save the file, refresh the page. The elements have been pushed away again. Now let's add margin left, 20 pixels, and margin right, 20 pixels again, to our links too. Save the file, refresh the page. The elements have been pushed away again. Now this link's text went down to the next line because there is not enough horizontal space to fit it in the same line. Let me resize the browser window a little bit. There you go. And if I open Developer Tools and inspect our link, there is this orange margin area to the left and right. Okay, if the box modal seems too complex and overwhelming, don't worry, it just takes time to master it. Watch this video on the box modal, experiment with those properties on your own, and have some rest. Repeat that several times and you'll start to get it. So, block elements start on a new line and inline elements don't. Block elements by default take up the full width available, whereas inline elements only take up as much width as they need for the content. We can change the width and height properties for block elements, but we cannot change the width and height properties for inline elements. For inline elements, their width and height are determined by their content. Every HTML element has 4 layers, like an onion: content, padding, border, and margin. For block elements, paddings, Borders and margins from all sides will cause other elements to be pushed away. For inline elements, only the left and right paddings, borders and margins will cause other elements to be pushed away. And these were the essentials of the box modal in CSS. Now you'll learn how to move an element relative to its original position on the screen and how to make it stay in the same position when scrolling. Then we'll use all that to create a simple modal window. By default, the browser displays HTML elements on the page in the order as they appear in HTML. In CSS, this is called normal flow. Block elements go top to bottom. Inline elements go left to right. We can remove HTML elements from the normal flow and move them around with custom CSS. I'm going to close this example and we'll start from a blank page. We need some content to style. So I'm going to create 3 paragraphs. The first one is HTML for structure. The second will be CSS for styling. And the third one is going to be PHP for backend. Save the file, refresh the page. Good. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. That's better. Now I'll style them a little bit. For that, I'll add a CSS rule. I'll use a tag selector to find all the paragraphs. Let's add a solid border, 4 pixels, solid. The color will be royal blue. Okay, now I'd like them to have more space inside, so I'm going to add padding, and also I'll make them a little shorter, and I'd like to have them some background. I'll add padding 10 pixels to have padding from all sides. For the background, I'll paste a hex color, and the width is going to be 300 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. This is better. Now, let's say we want to move the CSS paragraph down and to the right. We could use margins for that. Let's add a class CSS to the paragraph and another CSS rule. Okay, remember, if we want to move our element down, we add a margin from the top. So margin top, what about 30 pixels? And if we want to move our element to the right, we add margin from the left. So margin left, 35 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. Great. Now our paragraph is 30 pixels down and 35 pixels to the right. But it also pushed down the next paragraph. For certain tasks, that's fine, but for some, that's not. This time, I only want to move the CSS paragraph and not affect the others. In this case, margins won't help us. So let's remove both properties. Save the file, refresh the page. Okay, it's back to its original position. And now to only move the CSS paragraph and don't affect the other elements, we'll use a new property called position. The default value it has from the browser is static. This means act like a regular HTML element. For our goals, let's change it to relative. Save the file, refresh the page, and nothing has changed so far. But now we have access to additional properties: top, right, bottom, and left. Let's use the top property and see what happens. We'll set it to 15 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. Okay, it's 15 pixels lower from its original position. And it didn't push the PHP paragraph down, just what we wanted. And if I increase the top property, say to 30 pixels, save the file, refresh the page, it even starts to overlap with the PHP paragraph, but still doesn't push it away. Great. And what about the other properties? Let's use the left property and see what happens. Say 35 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page, and it's 35 pixels to the right. Great. Now you might be thinking, that's weird. When we configured the top property, the browser moved our paragraph down. And when we set the left property, it moved to the right. And the reason for that is that the top property sets the element's distance from the top, and the left property sets the element's distance from the left. The same works for the bottom and right properties. Let's use them. I'm going to remove these, Save the file, refresh the page. The paragraph is back to its normal position. Now I'll add bottom 30 pixels and right 35 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. Now it's 30 pixels to the top and 35 pixels to the left. And part of this paragraph is now even outside of this page. So when we change position to relative, we can move then that element relative to its original location with the top, right, left, and bottom properties. And this affects only where the element appears and doesn't push other elements away. And also notice that the browser keeps the space intact, as if the element is still where it originally would be. The next interesting value for the position property is absolute. It's going to give us very different results. Save the file, refresh the page. Okay, so now the CSS paragraph has moved to a completely different place. It's 35 pixels from the right and 30 pixels from the bottom of the browser window. And now there is no empty space here. These two paragraphs just collapsed as if the CSS paragraph doesn't exist. That's because when we set position absolute, we have removed the CSS paragraph from the normal flow. That is, we have moved it from the layer where normal elements are to a separate layer. Okay, now let me show you what happens with different combinations of bottom, right, left, and top properties for an absolutely positioned element. If I comment out the bottom property, so only the right is applied, the browser places our paragraph 35 pixels from the right of the screen. And it keeps its original position vertically. Now you might be asking, if it keeps its original position vertically, then it must be on the same level as the PHP paragraph. Why is it lower? That's a good question. The answer is that because now it's on its own separate layer, its top margin doesn't collapse. And what is margin collapsing? Margin collapsing happens when the bottom and top margins of block elements are combined into one margin, which takes the size of the largest individual margin. And because by default, Google Chrome adds 16 pixels top and bottom margins to all paragraphs, it merges or collapses the HTML paragraph's bottom margin and the PHP paragraph's top margin into a single margin, which is 16 pixels. If I open Developer Tools, so Option Command I for Mac or Control Shift I for Windows, and inspect any of the two paragraphs, you can see that their margins, so these orange rectangles, they overlap. And if I inspect the PHP paragraph, for example, you can see that its top margin is exactly 16 pixels. So the browser doesn't add their margins. It only uses one, the biggest. This happens between vertically adjacent block level elements, which at this moment are these two paragraphs. And so it's like when their margins are touching and there is no content between, their margins collapse. But there is content between the first and the third paragraphs. It's the CSS paragraph, you might argue. Well, the thing is that now its position is absolute. So it exists in its own little world or its own layer, and it doesn't exist for these two paragraphs that are in the normal flow. This means that at this moment, there is nothing in between these two paragraphs, and their margins are touching and collapsing. But the margin of this CSS paragraph doesn't collapse because it exists on its own separate layer. It doesn't touch anything at the moment, and so its margin pushes the CSS paragraph down. And when I inspect the paragraph, you can see that it's precisely 16 pixels lower than the PHP paragraph. And to stop margin collapsing for these two paragraphs, I can put literally any content in between. So I'm gonna add the any text after the first paragraph. Save the file, refresh the page, and there you go. now their margins don't collapse and these two paragraphs are on the same level. Margin collapsing can give you unexpected results. The main thing to remember here is that when there are two block level elements and their margins are touching, the browser will keep only the biggest margins of those two. Okay, back to positioning. If I comment out the right option, save the file, refresh the page, now the CSS paragraph is in its original position, but on its own separate layer. So it overlaps the PHP paragraph. To prove that, I'm going to use the left property to move it, say 80 pixels from the left. Save the file, refresh the page. Great, now it's moved 80 pixels from the left and you can see a part of the PHP paragraph. Let me zoom out a little bit to have more screen space. And now if I comment out the left property and add top, say 30 pixels, save the file, refresh the page, and it's now moved 30 pixels from the top. Nice. Another interesting and useful quality here is that if we use two opposite properties like right and left or top and bottom, let me uncomment the bottom property, save the file, refresh the page. So the browser has stretched the CSS paragraph to reach 30 pixels from the top and 30 pixels from the bottom. The same works for the right and left properties. I'll uncomment them, save the file, refresh the page, and that's not what we expected. The paragraph is clearly 80 pixels from the left, but it's not stretched up to 35 pixels from the right. Why is that? Well, that's because we manually constrain the width of all paragraphs to 300 pixels in this rule, and it prevents the CSS paragraph from being stretched with positioning. In CSS, many different properties can affect an element's dimensions. Some of them have stronger influence, like the width property. To release our CSS paragraph from this 300 pixels constraint, we can override the width property specifically for our CSS paragraph. Remember, a class selector is stronger than a tag selector. The value is going to be auto. By doing that, we tell the browser there is no width constraint for this element. You can use other things to determine its width. Save the file, refresh the page, and there you go. Now it's stretched just like we wanted. We will use this stretching feature in a couple of minutes to create our modal window. Usually, you'd want to stretch out an element completely and not have any empty space. For that, I'll change all the positioning values to 0. So the element will be 0 pixels from the bottom, 0 pixels from the right, 0 pixels from the left, and 0 pixels from the top, like this. Save the file, refresh the page. Great. But notice that there is still this empty space at the top and bottom. Why is that? Let's use developer tools to find out. So Option Command I for Mac to open it. And I'm going to inspect our paragraph. Oh, okay, it's the default paragraph's margin adds that empty space. Let's reset it to 0. You already know how to do this from previous videos. So margin 0. Save the file, refresh the page. Great, the empty space is gone. Let me close Developer Tools, and this is exactly what we need. Now, before we get into creating a modal window, we've got a couple more features to discuss. So for that, let's put back the CSS paragraph to the bottom right corner. I'll remove all this and add bottom 30 pixels, right 35 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. Okay, at this stage, our paragraph is at the bottom right corner of the page. And our page is only one screen high, but modern websites are usually longer than one screen. Let's emulate that. For that, I'm going to add class PHP to the third paragraph and a new CSS rule, class selector, and the height is going to be, say, 600 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. Great, now our page is longer. And if I scroll down, our absolutely positioned CSS paragraph stays in its original place and eventually disappears. That's useful for some tasks. But for example, for modal windows, we would want it to stay fixed in the same place all the time. And it doesn't matter whether we scroll the page or not. For that, we'll use a different position value, which is fixed Save the file, refresh the page. Now, when I scroll, our paragraph remains fixed in the bottom right corner all the time. Fixed position works the same as absolute. The only major difference is that the element always stays fixed relative to the screen. And we configure where it's located with the same top, right, bottom, and left properties. Let me change bottom to top and right to left. Save the file, refresh the page. Great, it's fixed at the top left of the screen. Now, let me add another paragraph. It's gonna be for MySQL. So for MySQL for storing data. And let's make this paragraph fixed at the top, 60 pixels from the top and 80 pixels from the left. Now, both paragraphs are fixed and they overlap. And sometimes you want several positioned elements to overlap like this. But also what you'd want is to control which element goes on top or behind. We can control that in several ways. At this moment, MySQL paragraph covers CSS paragraph. That's because by default, the browser displays them in the order they appear in HTML. And if I place the CSS paragraph in our HTML code after the MySQL paragraph, save the file, refresh the page, now it's on top. I wouldn't recommend, though, relying on the HTML order to control where they appear, because this makes our styles so fragile. And there is a much better way in CSS. We can use a CSS property called z-index to control what elements go on top or behind. Now, if I set the z-index for the MySQL paragraph to 1, save the file, refresh the page, it goes to the front, even though the CSS paragraph is later in the HTML code. Now, if we wanted the CSS paragraph to be on top of the MySQL paragraph, we could set its z-index to a bigger number, so at least 2. Save the file, refresh the page, great. We can also set z-index to negative values. By default, all HTML elements have 0 as their z-index value. This means that if I set the z-index for the MySQL paragraph to -1, it should go behind. Save the file, refresh the page. Nice. Now it's behind the elements. Now we can only use the z-index property for positioned elements to change the order in which they appear on the page. And if I set the z-index to the elements from the normal flow, let's say for this PHP paragraph, this won't affect the order the PHP paragraph appears on this page. Let me show you that. I'm gonna set the z-index property for the PHP paragraph to a very high value, say 500. Save the file, refresh the page, and nothing has changed. The CSS paragraph is still on top. So z-index controls the layer order of positioned elements on your page. Higher numbers are on top. Z-index only works on positioned elements, that is, the elements with position relative, absolute, or fixed. It doesn't affect the elements with position static, and all the HTML elements have position static by default. Higher z-index values bring elements closer to the front. Lower z-index values push elements further behind. Z-index can have negative values, pushing elements behind others. Without z-index, positioned elements stack in the order they appear in HTML. Now, let's create a modal window using what we've learned so far. First, we'll need a div. It's gonna have the modal class. And for the content, let's use a simple text. Say something like, that's our modal content. And let's also add a thinking emoji here too. Save the file, refresh the page, and for now, it's just a regular div element, a part of the normal document flow. But usually modals appear over content of the page, sort of like floating above the rest. And it doesn't matter whether we scroll it or not, the modal should stay in the center. Okay, you already know that for that behavior, a perfect candidate would be to use position fixed. I'll add a new CSS rule here, and it's going to be modal, position, fixed. And let's place it at the top. I'll use 0. When we use 0, we don't need to put any units of measure. So I'm going to leave it like this. Save the file, refresh the page. Great. Now it's at the top. Next, I want our modal to have a nice semi-transparent black background that covers the entire web page. So I'm going to add the background property, and I'll write RGB for the color. We want the black color, so all zeros. Save the file, refresh the page. Okay, that's something. I think we need to make several improvements here. Let's make the background color semi-transparent. For that, we'll extend the color function and add the A character at the end. We've added it here to configure the alpha channel, that is the opacity of our color. Now we can add the fourth parameter, which is a decimal number between 0 and 1, where 0 is fully transparent, so the color disappears, and with 1, the color is fully opaque, like this. I want the color to be semi-transparent, so let's use 0.5. Save the file, refresh the page. Great, that's exactly what we need. Now let's stretch the modal window to cover the whole page. You already know how to do that. First, I'll add the bottom property, and it's going to be 0. This will stretch the modal vertically. Save the file, refresh the page. Good. Then I'll add left 0, right 0 to stretch our modal horizontally. Save the file, refresh the page. Good. It now covers the whole page. Notice that at this moment, the CSS paragraph is above our modal, but we want our modal window to be always on top. For that, I will assign the Z index a huge value, something like 1000. Save the file, refresh the page. Great. And if I scroll the page, the modal follows. Now, it would be nice to have a white background for our content and to move it closer to the center of the screen. For that, I'll wrap modal's content with another div that's going to have the modal content class. Good. Save the file, refresh the page. No changes in the browser so far. This is expected because we need to add another CSS rule. It's going to be a class selector, so modal content, and we want to set the background to white. Now, I could have used an RGB color here, but because we don't need any flexibility and it's a little easier to type this keyword, I used the keyword. Save the file, refresh the page. Good. Now the background is white. Next, we need to position our content div. So I'm going to add the position property, and it'll be absolute because we want to position it relative to the fixed parent. Save the file, refresh the page. Notice that now our div takes up as much space as its content, even though it's a block element. That's because when a block level element is absolutely positioned, it behaves differently, and it only takes up as much space as its content. Okay, now let's move it closer to the center of the screen. For that, I'll add top, say 100 pixels, and left, say 60 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. It's better, but I want it to be more to the right. So I'm going to increase the value of the left property to 160 pixels. Save the file, refresh the page. This is better. Usually a modal window has a close button. So let's add the button element, close, and let's also separate it from the text with a horizontal line. Save the file, refresh the page. There you go. And lastly, let's add some padding. So I'll write padding 20 pixels to have a 20 pixels padding from all sides. Save the file, refresh the page. Nice. And there you go. We have created a modal window with CSS. If I scroll, it stays in the same place and it has a nice semi-transparent black background that covers the whole page. Now, obviously, this is just an example and not a fully working modal. It's not interactive. If I click the close button, it doesn't close the modal window. That's because we'll need to write JavaScript code to handle that. but as your first modal window, I think it's great. So congratulations. Now, before I finish this video, I'd like to show you one way to make sure that the modal's content is always centered. Because now, if I resize the window or add more content, it won't be in the center. So to make it centered, I'll change the top and left values to 50%. This moves our content 50% down of its parent's height and 50% right of its parent's height. Save the file, refresh the page, and because the parent of our content is the modal div, I mean the div with the semi-transparent black background that takes up the whole screen, now our modal is exactly in the center of the screen. Well, its top left corner is in the center of the screen. This is something, but it's not exactly what we want. What we want is its center to always be in the center of the screen. To achieve that, I'll use a property we haven't discussed yet, and it's the transform property. We can use it to change how an element looks in many interesting ways, like rotate the element, scale it up or down, move the element around. In this video, I'm not going to delve into all the details of how it works and what we can do with this property, because there's a lot to discuss on that topic. So here we'll only use it to move our modal content. And for that, I'll write translate x -50% to move the modal content div 50% of its width to the left. Then I'll add a space and translate y -50% to move the modal content div 50% of its height to the top. And this should do the trick. I'm going to add a semicolon, save the file, refresh the page, and there you go. Now the content is in the center of the screen, and it always stays there no matter how much I resize the window. And this is how you center a positioned element. Okay, to position elements with CSS, use the position property. The most useful values for it are relative, absolute, and fixed. Use the top, right, bottom, and left properties to control the actual position of the element. Position relative keeps an element among the other in normal flow, and we can move that element relative to its original position without affecting the other elements. Position absolute removes an element from the normal flow to its own separate layer. Other elements behave as if it doesn't exist. Fixed position keeps an element fixed to its configured position even when we scroll. Finally, use the z-index property to control the order of overlapping positioned elements. And this is how you position elements with CSS. Now you'll learn how to include external CSS files. Then we'll include CSS Bootstrap and use a couple of its components. Bootstrap is one of the most popular CSS libraries, and we'll use it in future projects a lot. First, I'll show you how to create an external CSS file and use it on your web page. For that, we'll need a div element. It's going to have the PHP class. Its content will be PHP is for backend. Now let's style it a bit. I'll use a class selector and make it 500 pixels wide. The padding is going to be 20 pixels from all sides. Let's align its text to the center and add a border, 3 pixels, solid royal blue. There is nothing special here. The goal is just to have some styles that we can use in the future. Save the file, refresh the page. Good. At this point, we're keeping our CSS code in this HTML, in the style element. This is convenient and sufficient in certain cases, like when learning CSS or for running quick experiments. But most of the time, especially when your website grows or you're doing professional web development, you want to keep your CSS code in a separate file, and then include and load that file into your HTML page. Let me show you how to do this. The goal is to move our CSS code to a separate file and include it into this web page. So we'll need to create a new file. For that, I'm going to open the primary side panel, create a new file, and I'm going to name it main CSS. For your CSS files, I recommend you choosing a file name that reflects the purpose of your CSS code. Like if you have a CSS file that contains styles for a navbar, then name that file something like navbar CSS. Choosing good names for your CSS files will make it easier for you and other developers to navigate your project. Now I'm going to move this CSS rule to our CSS file. And let's remove this line. Save the file. Great. And I'm also going to remove this style element. We don't need it anymore. Let's also close the primary sidebar. Either use this option or this keyboard shortcut. I'm going to hit Command B. If I save this file and refresh the page, our div is back to its default styles. Our custom styles are gone. That's because for these styles to be applied, we need to include our main CSS file into this index.html file. To do that, we'll add the link tag to the head element of the index.html file and specify the location of our CSS file with the href attribute. Our CSS file is in the same location as the index.html file. So I'll just put its name, main CSS. But as with images, we can use an external URL here to load CSS from other sources. This is what we're going to do later to load Bootstrap. A CSS style sheet is not the only thing we can load with the link element. We can use it to load many other types of resources like fav icons and fonts. Okay, next we need to tell the browser that we're loading a CSS file with the rel attribute. For CSS, the value is going to be style sheet. Don't forget to include rel style sheet, otherwise the browser won't apply your styles. Link is a self-closing tag, so I'm going to put a closing angle bracket, save the file, refresh the page. Great, the browser has successfully loaded and applied our styles. If your styles didn't load, make sure that you put the CSS file in the same folder as the index.html file. Also, make sure that you specified the exactly same file name in the href attribute. Sometimes I tend to misspell it. And also make sure that you have the rel attribute and that the value is exactly the same as I have it here. Doing all that should solve the issue. Okay, we can also put the link tag in the body element and it will still work. However, it's better to have it in the head element, because in this case, the browser loads your CSS file before any HTML code and your styles are immediately applied. Now let's include the Bootstrap CSS library. For that, I'll Google Bootstrap and open the latest version of the website. At the moment, the latest version is 5.3.3, but yours can be different. Next, scroll down to the Include via CDN section and copy the link tag. CDN stands for Content Delivery Network. CDN is basically a network of servers in various locations worldwide. The main goal for a CDN is to deliver content like images, videos, CSS, and JavaScript files to you as quickly as possible. For that, CDN uses multiple techniques, like sending you this CSS file from the server that's closest to you. Okay, we're not interested in the Bootstrap's JavaScript in this video, so just copy the CSS link and paste it after our custom styles, like this. This link has a couple of extra attributes that we don't need to worry about. Also, notice that this link loads a remote CSS file from the internet. So save the file, and when I refresh the page, it has changed a little bit. That's because Bootstrap was loaded successfully and applied its own styles. Now let's add a couple of Bootstrap components to our page. For that, I'll go to the Bootstrap's website and click on the Docs link. Bootstrap has many different useful tools. I encourage you to experiment with them on your own. For now, we need the Components section. And let's open the list group item. I'm gonna scroll down until I find the component I like. This one, under the custom content, looks interesting. So to use it, I'm gonna copy the content from this example and paste it to our web page. Save the file, Refresh our page, and there you go. Now we've got an item list that's beautifully styled. Let's use another component. How about some spinners? Okay, so which ones to choose? I like these growing spinners. So let's copy their HTML and paste it before the list group HTML. Save the file, refresh our page. Great, we've got many spinners to choose from. Bootstrap is an amazing library and worth learning. Based on the W3 Tech statistics, it's the most used CSS library in the world. Okay, now let's recap. Use the link tag to add external style sheets to your web page. Specify the URL of your style sheet in the href attribute and tell the browser that it's CSS with the rel attribute. And this is how you add external style sheets to your web page. Alright, you've completed the entire CSS course. I want to congratulate you on your determination to learn. Now you're ready for your next step toward becoming a software developer, learning PHP. PHP is a backend programming language for building websites and is perfect for beginners. It's easy to learn, offers good job opportunities, competitive salaries, and provides a strong programming foundation. And because of that, I'm working now on a PHP course that covers everything you need to know to get from a beginner to a professional level. It's going to be an ongoing course with a lot of tips and shortcuts, practical advice, tons of exercises, and mini projects. We'll even build a YouTube using PHP to apply what you've learned. If you enjoyed this CSS course and are interested in learning PHP, subscribe to the channel to see new PHP tutorials as soon as they are uploaded. With a decade of software development experience, I have plenty to share. So by subscribing, you'll help me to create more useful content for you. Thank you and see you next time.